At 2:14 in the morning, the trauma surgeon stepped back from the table, pulled off his gloves, and said the words, "Nobody fights anymore. Call it." The monitor held its flat, merciless tone. Every nurse in that room lowered their eyes. Every nurse except one. She was standing near the supply cart in the back, the one nobody remembered hiring, the one who'd been handing sutures to surgeons for 3 years without a single person learning her last name. She walked to the table. She looked at the body. She said, "He's not dead. You just stopped trying." And then she picked up the instruments herself. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. I want to see exactly how far this has traveled. Now let's go back to that operating room, because what happened next changed everything. The call had come in at 1:49 a.m., and by the time the ambulance bay doors blew open at Hargrove Regional Medical Center, the attending trauma physician on duty had already been awake for 19 hours. His name was Dr. Preston Aldgate, and he was the kind of surgeon who wore his reputation the way other men wore expensive watches, visibly, deliberately, and with the quiet expectation that everyone in the room would notice. He noticed the patient immediately. Male, mid-50s, blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen consistent with a high-speed vehicular impact. Airbag deployment, burns across the face and forearms. Left femur fractured. Internal bleeding confirmed by field medics. Blood pressure crashing through the floor by the time the gurney hit the bay. "What have we got?" Aldgate asked, already pulling on gloves. "Marcus Delray, 53, the paramedic read from his notes, jogging alongside the gurney. Found unresponsive at the scene of a single vehicle rollover on Route 9 outside Kettler. Airbag deployed, but the door caved in. Steering column impacted the thorax. BP was 60 over palp when we got to him, dropped to 40 in transport. We pushed 2 units of O-neg. Who called it in?" "Anonymous. 911 dispatch got a hang-up from a burner number. No witnesses at the scene." Aldgate glanced at the man on the gurney. Something about that detail, the burner phone, the anonymity, the way the damage pattern didn't quite match a standard rollover, sat wrong with him. But he pushed the thought aside. He had a dying man and a window of maybe 4 minutes to do something about it. "Bay 3, he said. "Get Dr. Vasquez on the phone. Tell her we need cardiothoracic." The charge nurse that night was a woman named Donna Pfeiffer, and she had run the overnight ER at Hargrove for 11 years. She relayed the orders without blinking, set the team in motion with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen chaos so many times it no longer read as chaos, just noise with a pattern underneath. The nurse who caught the gurney on the far end of Bay 3 was not Donna. She was younger, quieter. She wore her dark blonde hair pulled back with a clip that was slightly crooked, and she moved through the controlled disorder of the trauma bay the way certain people move through crowded rooms, efficiently, without drawing attention, occupying exactly as much space as necessary and no more. Her name was Sera Wallin. She had been working night shifts at Hargrove for 3 years. She was 28 years old. She was, by every observable metric, unremarkable, competent, consistent, rarely late, never wrong with a medication calculation, and almost completely invisible to the physicians she assisted. The attendings learned her face the way they learned the location of the supply drawers, functionally, without curiosity. She had never corrected a doctor. She had never pushed back on an order. She had, on 3 separate occasions, noticed errors that would have harmed patients, and each time she had found a way to quietly redirect the situation without making anyone feel challenged. A suggestion framed as a question. A supply run that created just enough delay. Once, a calm mention of a contraindication phrased so carefully that the prescribing physician repeated it back as though it had been his own observation. Sera was good at being invisible. She had been practicing it for years. She helped transfer Marcus Delray from the gurney to the trauma bay table, checked his pupils with a pen light, unequal dilation, left worse than right, and began cutting away his shirt while the monitor leads went on. The waveform that came up was ragged and deteriorating. His systolic was reading 42. "Ultrasound," Aldgate said, and the machine was already rolling toward him. The fast exam took 40 seconds. Significant free fluid in the abdomen. pericardial effusion developing. The man was bleeding into his chest cavity, and the pressure was beginning to compress his heart. "He needs the OR," Aldgate said. "Now, where's Vasquez?" 15 minutes out, Donna said from across the room. She was at home. 15 minutes, Aldgate repeated, and something shifted in his jaw. Not panic, but the particular tightness of a man recalculating odds he doesn't like. "Get me a thoracotomy tray. We're not waiting." Sera moved to the supply cabinet. She pulled the tray. She set it up in the specific order she had watched thoracotomy trays assembled dozens of times, and she did it without being asked twice about anything. What she was also doing, while her hands were occupied, was watching. She watched the way Marcus Del Rey's chest rose and fell. Shallow. Asymmetric. The right side lagging. She watched the monitor trace. She watched the color of his lips shift from pale to grayish blue and back. She watched the way the fluid in his abdomen pooled on ultrasound and thought about the angle of impact described by the paramedic. Steering column, thorax, left of center. Something didn't fit. The pattern of injuries didn't match a simple compression injury from a steering column. The damage distribution was wrong. She had seen this pattern before, and not in a hospital. She said nothing. Not yet. Aldgate opened the chest. He was fast. She would give him that. His hands were confident, and the technique was clean. He located the source of the hemorrhage in the left thoracic cavity, a laceration along the descending aorta, and began working to control it. The problem came 11 minutes in. Aldgate had been working the aortic repair when the pressure dropped again, catastrophically this time, the monitor screaming, and in the scramble to respond, he reached for the wrong vessel. Sera saw it before he touched it. He was about to clamp the pulmonary artery. If he did that, Marcus Del Rey would be dead in under 90 seconds. "Doctor," her voice was level. "That's not the bleeder. That's the pulmonary." Aldgate's hand stopped a centimeter from the vessel. The room went silent in the specific way rooms go silent when something catastrophic has been avoided by a margin so thin it barely exists. He turned and looked at her. She was holding a suction catheter, her eyes on the surgical field, her face completely steady. "What did you say?" he asked. "The pulmonary artery is lateral to where you're reaching. The active hemorrhage is posterior. You can see it if you retract the left lower lobe." Aldgate stared at her for 2 full seconds. Then he turned back to the field. He retracted the lobe. She was right. The bleed was posterior. He had been about to close off a vessel that would have stopped the man's heart in under 2 minutes. He found the correct site. He clamped it. He began the repair. Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment. Then the monitor tone shifted. Still dangerous, still ragged, but no longer the sound of a man actively dying. Marcus Del Rey's pressure crept upward. 60. 72. The color of the surgical field changed. Aldgate finished the primary repair and stepped back slightly. His shoulders dropped a fraction, the release of sustained physical tension. He looked at Sera again. She was already cleaning the suction catheter, preparing the next instrument he would need without being told. "Wallin," he said. "Yes, sir." "Where did you train?" It was a simple question. The answer was not. "Nursing program at Cantrell University," she said. "Graduated 6 years ago." "That's not what I'm asking." She handed him the next instrument. "I know what you're asking, doctor, but you need a 3-0 proline to finish the suture line, and Marcus Del Rey needs you focused on the field." Aldgate took the suture. He finished the repair. He did not ask again, but he didn't stop watching her. Marcus Del Rey made it to the ICU at 3:47 a.m. in critical but stable condition. By 4:15, the quiet machinery of the hospital had resumed its overnight rhythm. Monitors beeping at regulated intervals, the soft sound of rolling carts in the corridors, the particular hush of a building full of people either trying to sleep or trying to keep others alive. Sera was at the nursing station writing her incident notes when Dr. Aldgate appeared at the edge of the desk. He had changed out of his surgical gown and was holding a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He set the cup down. He looked at the notes she was writing. "You're documenting your observation during the procedure," he said. It wasn't a question. Standard protocol, she said. You know what happens if you submit that officially? I submit all my observations. That's also standard protocol. He studied her for a moment. I'm going to request your HR file in the morning. She looked up from her notes. You're welcome to. It's not very interesting. I think it might be more interesting than you're letting on. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to be clear she wasn't uncomfortable, and then returned to her notes. Good night, doctor. He left. Sera finished her documentation, filed it, and went to check on the other patients on her rotation. She had 4 more hours on her shift and she intended to work all of them. At 5:20 a.m., she was in the supply room when Donna Pfeiffer came to find her. Donna had worked 11 years at this hospital. She had seen residents cry in supply closets and attendings make mistakes they never admitted, and administrators do things to nurses that didn't have kind names. She was not easily rattled. She looked rattled. There are 2 men at the nurses' station asking for you, she said. They're not family. They're not patients. They're... Sera, they showed badges. What kind of badges? I don't... Federal. I think federal. They asked for you by your full name, your full legal name. Sera set down the box she was holding. Something shifted in her expression. Not fear, exactly, but the careful adjustment of someone recalibrating a situation they had been privately monitoring. Did they say what it's about? They said it was related to the patient admitted tonight. Delray. Donna lowered her voice even further. Sera, one of them is military. He's in uniform. Sera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't put them anywhere private. Keep them in the main station. Donna looked at her. You're not scared. Of course I'm scared, Sera said. But scared doesn't mean anything useful right now. She pulled off her gloves, dropped them in the waste bin, and washed her hands at the utility sink. She dried them deliberately. She straightened her scrubs. She walked out of the supply room and down the corridor toward the nurses' station. The 2 men were standing near the desk rather than sitting in the waiting area, which told her something about who they were. One wore a dark jacket and had the posture of someone who had spent years in rooms where posture was monitored. The other was in Army service uniform, Class A, the formal version, which was unusual enough at 5 a.m. in a hospital that it drew glances from every passing nurse. The man in the jacket spoke first. Sera Wallin? That's me. Special Agent Thomas Breck, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. He produced a credential case. Real. She didn't need to look closely to know it. This is Lieutenant Colonel Harlan Voss, Medical Corps. Lieutenant Colonel Voss nodded. He was in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something harder than age alone could account for. We need to ask you some questions about Marcus Delray, Breck said. He's a patient in my care, she said. His medical information is protected. We're not asking about his medical information. Breck paused. We're asking about you. She looked at him evenly. What about me? We have a recording from the trauma bay, the hospital's surveillance system. We'd like you to walk us through what you did during the procedure this morning. I assisted the attending surgeon. You can read my incident notes. They were filed at 4:47. We've read them, Voss said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His voice was very quiet. That's actually why we're here. He reached into a folder he was carrying and placed a photograph on the nurse's station counter. It was a still image from the trauma bay recording, enhanced, slightly grainy, clearly captured from a ceiling-mounted camera. It showed Sera's hands in the surgical field. The suture configuration you were describing to Dr. Aldgate, Voss said. The retraction pattern, the way you identified the posterior bleed from a lateral approach without direct visualization. He paused. That's a very specific skill set. I've assisted in many procedures. Not this one, he said. This one is something you don't learn in a hospital. The nursing station was quiet around them. Donna had positioned herself near the medication cabinet, not looking at them but clearly listening. 2 other nurses on the far end of the station had found reasons to be very busy with paperwork. Sera picked up the photograph. She looked at it. She set it back down. What do you want to know? She said. We want to know, Breck said carefully, whether the woman we're looking for and the woman standing in front of us are the same person. She held his gaze. That depends on who you're looking for. Voss reached into the folder a second time. He placed another document on the counter. It was a military service record, the kind that should have been classified, the kind that required a specific clearance level to access. The photograph attached to the record was smaller, and the hair was different, shorter, but the face was unmistakable. The name on the record was not Sera Wallin. She looked at the document for a long moment. Something passed through her expression. Not panic, not grief exactly, but the particular resignation of someone who has been quietly waiting for a specific door to open for years and is now standing in front of it. You've been sitting on that file for a while, she said. 14 months, Voss said. We've been looking for you since the discharge paperwork came through. Then you know the discharge was voluntary. We know the official version, he said. We also know that the official version leaves out about 60% of what actually happened. A cart rolled past in the corridor. Someone's monitor beeped 3 times and then settled. The hospital kept moving around them, indifferent to the particular weight of the conversation happening at desk 4 of the overnight nursing station. We're not here to cause problems for you, Breck said. That's not what this is. Then what is it? He glanced at Voss. Something passed between them. The quick, practiced exchange of men who have worked together long enough to communicate in shorthand. Marcus Del Rey wasn't in a car accident, Voss said. Sera didn't react visibly. He was run off the road, Voss continued, deliberately, by people who knew exactly who he was and what he was carrying when he left the meeting in Kettler 3 hours before the crash. What was he carrying? Documentation. Physical copies. The kind of documentation that doesn't exist on any server. Voss looked at her steadily. Marcus Del Rey spent 11 years as a defense contractor working with a federal oversight committee. He collected evidence of a criminal operation that goes up several levels. The night before the crash, he made contact with an investigator. 2 hours later, someone tried to kill him. The supply room was 15 feet behind her. The nurse's lounge was at the end of the hall. All the normal geography of the place she had spent 3 years moving through without calling attention to herself. You're telling me he's still a target, she said. We're telling you, Breck said, that whoever tried to kill him doesn't know yet whether he survived. If they find out he's here, in this hospital, alive, they'll try again. Sera was quiet for a moment. She thought about the man in the ICU, the damage pattern that hadn't matched a standard collision, the anonymous 911 call from a burner phone, the things she had noticed and filed away and not mentioned. He needs a secondary security protocol on his room, she said. Not hospital security, your people. Already requested, Voss said, but it'll take 4 hours to get physical assets here from the regional office. 4 hours. Yes. She looked at the nurse's station, at the monitor bank above the desk that showed the telemetry feeds from the ICU rooms. Room 7, Marcus Del Rey. Stable. Heart rate 64. Blood pressure holding. Then I'm not leaving this floor, she said. Breck looked at her. Miss Wallin? Nurse Wallin, she said. It was quiet, but it landed with weight. And I'm not going home. I'm staying on shift. If something happens to that patient before your people get here, it happens while I'm standing between him and whatever comes through that door. Voss studied her for a long moment. In the pale fluorescent light of the overnight nursing station, with her badge slightly crooked and a crescent of dried surgical antiseptic still on her left forearm, she looked like what she had spent 3 years making herself look like. But Voss had served 22 years. He had worked alongside enough people who carried things they didn't advertise to recognize the specific quality of stillness she had. Some people are calm because nothing is happening to them. Some people are calm because they have already been through things that made ordinary chaos feel manageable. Voss knew the difference. 4 hours, he said. We'll have eyes on the corridor in the meantime. I want to know the moment something changes, she said, either with the security arrangement or with him. Either one. Understood. She picked up her incident notes from the desk where she'd left them. She adjusted the clip in her hair, still slightly crooked. She looked at both men one more time. Gentlemen, she said. She walked back down the corridor toward the ICU. At 6:03 a.m., Hargrove Regional Medical Center received a new staff rotation request. It was filed through the facility's administration system, submitted by an outside medical staffing agency the hospital contracted for overflow shifts. The request was for one additional ICU support technician for the morning shift, a routine filing, the kind that came through 2 or 3 times per week without anyone reviewing it closely. The name on the filing was Theodore Marsh. His credentials checked out in the system. His photo badge, when printed at the facilities desk, showed a man in his late 30s with a narrow face and close-set eyes who did not look particularly memorable. He was scheduled to begin his shift at 7 a.m. At 6:51 a.m., Sera was checking Marcus Del Rey's vitals when she noticed the overnight charge log on the ICU desk. New staff edition. Morning shift. ICU support. Theodore Marsh. She looked at the name. She looked at the time the request had been submitted. 6:03 a.m. She thought about what Voss had told her, about the documentation Marcus Del Rey was carrying, about someone who didn't yet know whether he had survived. 6:03 a.m. was 3 hours and 14 minutes after Marcus Del Rey had been admitted, which meant someone had found out he was alive. She set down the chart. She walked to the nurse's station and picked up the internal phone. She dialed the extension for hospital security. While it rang, she looked down the corridor toward the ICU entrance. The elevator at the far end of the hall chimed once. The doors opened. A man in scrubs stepped out. Narrow face, close-set eyes. He was carrying a small equipment bag and moving with the practiced casualness of someone who had rehearsed what they were doing. He looked at the room numbers on the wall placards. His eyes stopped on room 7. The phone in Sera's hand rang once more and then clicked over to hold music. She hung up. She set the phone down on the counter. And she started walking. She started walking, not running, running. Running draws attention. Running makes patients look up from their beds, and nurses turn from their stations, and a man with close-set eyes and a practiced walk check his peripheral vision. Sera moved fast but kept her footsteps even, her arms loose, her face carrying the neutral expression of someone with somewhere to be, and no particular reason to explain it. The man in scrubs, Theodore Marsh, or whoever he actually was, had already passed the first room. He was looking at the number plaques with just enough casualness to be unconvincing, the way people look at things when they're trying not to look like they're looking. Room 7 was 12 feet ahead of him. Sera came around the corner of the ICU corridor and put herself between him and the door. "Can I help you?" she said. He stopped, looked at her. The practiced ease was still there, but something behind his eyes recalibrated fast. The involuntary micro-adjustment of someone who had not expected an obstacle. "Just starting my shift," he said. "ICU support. Theodore Marsh." He reached for his badge. "I know who you're scheduled as," she said. "I need to see your agency credential, the original, not the hospital-printed badge. Contracting protocol." She was making that up. There was no such protocol. But she said it the way you say things that exist, and he didn't know the hospital's internal procedures well enough to call her on it immediately. His hand stayed near his badge. His eyes moved to the door of room 7, then back to her. "I wasn't told about that," he said. "It was added 6 weeks ago. Data security issue with a staffing agency in the metro region. Administration sent a memo." She held out her hand. "The original credential. It should have a watermark on the lower left." He reached into his equipment bag. Later, when she had time to think about it, she would identify that moment as the one where everything could have gone badly. He reached into the bag and she did not know what he was reaching for. And she was standing 18 inches from him in a hospital corridor at 6:51 in the morning with no backup and no weapon, and the nearest security camera pointed the wrong direction. What she had was her body language and his uncertainty and 3 seconds of advantage. She closed the distance. Not toward the bag, toward him, stepping into his space the way you step into the space of someone you trust, someone you're showing something to, close enough that his arm couldn't extend without making contact with her. He froze for half a second, the instinctive hesitation of someone whose plan assumed space and found none. In that half second, she had his wrist. She didn't break it. She didn't need to. She applied pressure to the specific joint that made the fingers lose their grip regardless of what the brain was telling them, and whatever he'd been reaching for dropped back into the bag. "Hey, ICU is a restricted access floor," she said, and her voice was exactly as calm as it had been when she told Aldgate about the pulmonary artery. Your shift paperwork wasn't cleared by the charge nurse. That means you're here without authorization. I'm going to need you to step back to the elevator, and we're going to call downstairs and verify your credentials. His eyes were doing a fast calculation. She could feel it in the tension of his wrist. You're a nurse, he said. It came out slightly wrong. Not quite contemptuous, but close enough. That's right, she said. He pulled against her grip, testing it. She adjusted her thumb placement by 2 centimeters, and his elbow lost its leverage, and he stopped pulling. I'm going to need to insist, she said. Somewhere behind them, a door opened. One of the ICU rooms. A night nurse named Priya came out with an empty IV bag and looked at them with the blank surprise of someone who had not expected to find 2 people standing very close together in the corridor. Priya, Sera said without looking away from the man. Can you call security to the ICU floor? We have a credentialing issue. Priya looked at them for 2 seconds. She was 26, 6 months out of nursing school, and she had learned already that when Sera Wallin said something in that specific tone, you didn't ask follow-up questions. She went back inside and picked up the room phone. The man's eyes cut to the door and back. His window was closing, and he knew it. This is a misunderstanding, he said. Maybe, Sera said. Let's go sort it out downstairs. She walked him to the elevator. She kept her hand near his arm, but not on it, close enough to matter, loose enough to look like she was just walking alongside him. The elevator opened. She did not get in. Lobby security will meet you at the doors, she said. He stepped into the elevator. He looked at her as the doors closed. The look he gave her was not the look of a man who felt like he'd had a misunderstanding. She memorized his face. Then she turned and walked fast to the nurse's station and picked up the phone and called the number Voss had given her at 5:30 that morning. He picked up on the second ring. Someone just tried to get access to room 7, she said. I've sent him downstairs. He's in the elevator right now. Narrow face, late 30s, about 170 pounds, scrubs with a blue trim, carrying a small gray equipment bag. He had something in that bag he was reaching for. A pause. You're certain? He knew which room to go to without checking a chart. Staffing credentials cleared the admin system at 6:03, 3 hours after Del Rey was admitted. Someone found out fast. Voss, whoever you have watching this corridor, they need to intercept that elevator. Copy. She heard him say something away from the phone, a terse exchange with someone else in the room. Then, are you hurt? No. Did he touch anyone else on the floor? No, I intercepted before he got to the room. Another pause. Shorter this time. Wallin, how did you stop him without... He didn't finish the sentence. Credentialing protocol, she said. Completely standard. She hung up. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about hands. They didn't shake until afterward, when the adrenaline found nowhere to go and the body finally got the message that the moment was over. She had about 20 minutes before her fingers would betray her with a fine tremor, and she intended to use them. She went back to room 7. She checked Marcus Del Rey's vitals manually, not trusting just the monitor read. Blood pressure holding, heart rate 68, oxygen saturation 94. Still sedated, still intubated, but the numbers were where she wanted them. She stood at the foot of his bed and looked at him. 53 years old, heavy hands, the kind that came from years of work, not gym equipment. A small scar above his right eyebrow that was old enough to be white. He had been carrying documentation that someone had tried to kill him for, and now he was in a hospital bed with a repaired aorta and a death sentence still waiting on him, and the only thing standing between him and that sentence for the next 3.5 hours was a nurse on an overnight shift. She thought about what Voss had said. A federal oversight committee. 11 years of evidence, the kind of documentation that doesn't exist on any server. She thought about the equipment bag the man in the scrubs had been reaching into. She pulled up the chair from the corner of the room and sat down where she could see both the door and the monitor. She did not sleep. At 7:22 a.m., Special Agent Breck called her back. He's in custody, he said. Elevator stopped at the lobby level, and we had 2 agents waiting. He ran, made it about 40 feet before one of our people took him down in the parking structure. What was in the bag? A pause. We're not releasing that information. I'm the one who stopped him from getting to the room. I understand that. I'm still not releasing it. She pressed her teeth together briefly. Fine. Is there anything in the bag that means I need to be concerned about what he may have already done on this floor before I intercepted him? A longer pause this time. We don't believe he had access to the patient before you stopped him. You don't believe. Based on timing, he came up from facilities at 6:48. You stopped him at 6:51. The corridor camera shows he didn't enter any patient rooms. 3 minutes. 3 minutes between him stepping off the elevator and her reaching him. Okay, she said. We're getting assets to the hospital faster than the original estimate. I'll have 2 people on your floor within 90 minutes. I'll be here. She ended the call. The morning shift was starting to filter in. Day nurses arriving. The particular sound of the hospital adjusting its rhythm from overnight minimal to daytime operational. She heard voices at the nursing station, the sound of a cart, the soft shuffle of someone checking in for their rotation. At 7:35, a woman appeared in the doorway of room 7. She was in her mid-50s, wearing a white coat over business clothes rather than scrubs, with dark hair cut short and the kind of posture that was either natural or the result of years of environments where posture was noted. She had a hospital administrator's badge, and she was looking at Sera with an expression that was evaluating rather than friendly. "Nurse Wallin?" she said. "Yes." "I'm Dr. Miriam Ostergaard, Chief Medical Officer." She looked at Marcus Delray, then back at Sera. "I've been briefed on the incident this morning, both incidents." A pause. "You should go home. Your shift ended at 7. Sera looked at her. "I'd prefer to stay until the federal security personnel are in place." "That's not a decision that falls within nursing discretion. With respect, Dr. Ostergaard, someone just attempted to access this patient's room with what federal agents are describing as materials intended to cause harm. I'd like to be here until I know he's secure." Ostergaard studied her for a moment. She had the look of someone who was used to winning these exchanges, not through aggression but through the simple institutional weight of her position. "You've been here since 7 last night," she said. "Yes." "That's 13 hours. I'm aware." Dr. Aldgate filed a report this morning about the surgical procedure. He noted your intervention. The way she said intervention left it slightly ambiguous whether she considered it a positive. "It was a standard observation," Sera said. "That prevented a fatal error by a senior attending surgeon." Ostergaard's voice was neutral. "That's not standard. That's also, depending on how it's documented, a credentialing issue. You don't have surgical privileges." Sera had been waiting for this one, not from Ostergaard specifically, from someone. The administrative reckoning that comes after the crisis, when the hospital returns to thinking about liability and chain of command, and the question of what a nurse is and isn't permitted to do. "I didn't perform any procedure," Sera said. "I identified an error in real time and communicated it verbally to the attending surgeon, who then made the clinical decision. My documentation is precise on that point." "Your documentation is very precise," Ostergaard agreed. There was something in her tone that was almost not quite like respect. Unusually precise. "I'm careful." "Apparently." Ostergaard looked at the patient again. "The federal agents will be here at 9 o'clock. I'll ask you to stay through that handoff. After that, you're going home." "Understood." Ostergaard turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "Dr. Aldgate also noted in his report that you have knowledge that goes significantly beyond your documented training. Dr. Aldgate is a thorough reporter." "He is?" She looked back at Sera. "He also said, and I'm quoting directly, whatever she learned somewhere that made this hospital look like a controlled environment." A beat. "I didn't know what that meant when I read it. I'm starting to think I do." She left. Sera watched the door settle closed. She turned back to Marcus Delray's monitor. 66. Blood pressure holding, oxygen 95. She exhaled very slowly. At 8:10 a.m., Marcus Delray's sedation began to lift. It wasn't supposed to happen yet. The plan had been to keep him under until the afternoon, until the pulmonary team could reassess and the surgical resident had cleared the repairs. But bodies don't always follow plans, and his metabolism was burning through the sedative faster than the dosing had anticipated. He moved first. Just his fingers, a small clench against the bedsheet. Then his eyes. Not opening, but moving beneath the lids with the restless quality of someone surfacing from very deep water. Sera moved to the bedside. "Mr. Delray, you're in a hospital. You're safe. Don't try to move." His eyes opened. They were brown and unfocused and full of the specific confusion of someone who doesn't know how much time has passed. He looked at her. His mouth moved around the endotracheal tube. "Don't try to talk," she said. "You have a breathing tube. You're breathing fine, but I need you to leave it alone. Squeeze my hand if you understand." His right hand, which she'd placed hers near, squeezed once. Weak but deliberate. "Good. You were in an accident. You're at Hargrove Regional. You've had surgery and you're stable. You're going to be okay." She watched his eyes. The confusion was clearing faster than she expected. He was more alert than the sedation level should have allowed. "Is there pain? Squeeze once for yes, twice for no." "One squeeze." "I'll tell the resident. They can adjust your medication." She kept her voice even. "There are people here who are going to make sure you're safe. Do you understand?" One squeeze. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the monitors, the IV lines, the window with its angle of morning light. Then they came back to her. He squeezed her hand twice. Not the pain response. Something else. 2 deliberate squeezes, and then his fingers arranged themselves in a way that was not random. Index and middle finger extended. The others curled, and he moved them in a small, controlled pattern against her palm. She went very still. She knew that pattern. It was a field communication signal, the kind used in environments where radio silence was mandatory and hand signals were the only language available. She had not seen it in 4 years, and she recognized it instantly and completely, the way you recognize certain things that were wired into you in conditions that made forgetting impossible. He wasn't communicating pain, he was communicating, "I know who you are." She kept her face neutral, her voice steady. "The medical team will be in shortly," she said. His fingers moved again. Different pattern this time, slower. She watched them and translated without wanting to. Not safe. They're already inside. Her eyes went to the door. The corridor was visible through the window panel. Normal morning traffic, nurses and a resident and someone from dietary with a cart. Nothing out of place. Nothing that looked wrong. She looked back at him. "How many?" She signed against his hand, small and hidden between their palms. He held up 2 fingers. Then he closed his eyes. His oxygen saturation dropped 2 points and then steadied. He was fading back under. His system had used everything it had for that brief window of consciousness and was pulling him back down. His fingers went slack. She stood at his bedside for a moment with her hand still near his, thinking about what 2 fingers meant. 2. Not 1. The man in the scrubs had been one. There was another. She thought about the equipment bag, the corridor camera, the 3 minutes of window between when he'd arrived and when she'd stopped him. She thought about what Breck had said. "We don't believe he had access to the patient before you stopped him." Don't believe. Not, he didn't. She walked to the door and looked both ways down the corridor. The dietary cart was moving away. The resident had gone into a different room. The night nurses who had stayed over for handoff were gathered at the station. One of them was someone she didn't recognize. He was standing slightly to the left of the main cluster, looking at a tablet, wearing the right color scrubs and the right kind of badge. And she had worked this floor for 3 years and she knew every face on the overnight rotation, and she did not know his. He glanced up. For exactly 1 second, their eyes met. He looked back at the tablet. She walked toward the station at the same unhurried pace she'd used before, and while she walked, she was counting steps and distance and angles and running a calculation about whether she could reach him before he reached the room, and what happened if she was wrong, and what happened if she was right. She reached the station. She picked up the phone. She dialed Voss's number. It went to voicemail. She dialed Breck. It rang 4 times. The man with the tablet looked up again. His eyes went from her to the room 7 door, back to her. She was still on hold. He closed the tablet. He started walking toward room 7. Sera set the phone on the counter. She looked at Donna Pfeiffer, who was sitting 3 feet away with a patient file open in front of her. "Donna," she said, "pull the emergency lockdown on ICU. Right now." Donna looked up. "What?" "Red protocol. Fire the alarm for this floor only. Do it now." Donna had worked 11 years at this hospital. She had never fired a floor lockdown without a direct order from administration or a physician. She looked at Sera, and she looked at the man walking toward room 7, and something in what she saw made her reach for the panel under the desk without asking another question. The lockdown alarm was not loud. It was a specific tone, low, pulsing, designed to alert staff without panicking patients. And when it fired, every door on the ICU floor went to controlled access, and every nurse on the floor knew exactly what it meant. The man with the tablet stopped. He looked at the doors. He looked at Sera, and Sera was already moving. She crossed the floor at a pace that was no longer careful or measured, and when he turned to run, the only direction available to him was toward the stairwell door, which had just gone to lockdown and would not open without a staff keycard. He hit it anyway, shoulder first. It didn't move. She reached him as he was turning around, and this time she didn't use anything as subtle as joint pressure. She used her weight and his momentum and the wall behind him, and he went down hard against the baseboard with her knee in his back and both his wrists at an angle that made movement an extremely unappealing option. "Don't," she said. One word. He stopped moving. The floor was in controlled chaos. Nurses responding to the lockdown, a resident coming out of a room with alarm on his face, someone at the far end of the corridor yelling for security. Donna appeared 2 seconds later with 2 of the day shift nurses and the security guard who had been stationed at the floor entrance and who had, until this moment, been very bored. "I need zip ties or restraint cuffs," Sera said, perfectly level, as though this were a supply request. "And someone call the federal agents downstairs and tell them we have the second one." The security guard produced handcuffs with the expression of a man who had trained for something and had, against all probability, encountered it. Sera stepped back. The guard took over. She stood up straight. She became aware that her knee hurt. She'd hit the floor at a bad angle, and she was going to feel it later. She became aware that her hands were shaking now, the fine tremor she'd been waiting for finally arriving 20 minutes late. She curled her fingers loosely and breathed out. Priya was standing near the station door with wide eyes and a blood pressure cuff she'd been holding when the alarm went off, still holding it, apparently having forgotten she was holding it. "Is that—" Priya started. "Yes," Sera said. "How did you—" "He looked at the room before he looked at the chart," Sera said. "When you actually need information, you look for the information. When you already know where you're going, you look at the destination." Priya stared at her. "It's fine," Sera said. "Reset your patient rounds. They're going to need statements from everyone on this floor, and I want the patients checked before anyone does anything administrative." Priya blinked. Then she moved. Sera walked back to the station and found the phone still on the counter where she'd left it, Breck having finally picked up and now talking into the air to nobody. She picked it up. "I have your second person," she said. "ICU floor, in security custody. You can come get him." A silence that lasted almost 4 full seconds. "Wallin," Breck said. "What exactly just—" "Your assets at 9 o'clock, she said. "Still happening?" "Yes, I'll be here." She set the phone down. She sat down in the chair at the nurse's station, and for a moment she just sat there with the lockdown tone still pulsing softly around her, and she let her hands shake for about 45 seconds, and then she made them stop. From down the corridor, through the window panel of room 7, she could see the soft green trace of Marcus Del Rey's heart monitor. Steady, consistent, the line of a man who was still alive. She watched it for a moment. Then Dr. Preston Aldgate walked out of the elevator. He had not been on the schedule. He was in street clothes, a jacket over a collared shirt, car keys still in his hand, and he was looking at the lockdown lights on the ceiling with the expression of someone who had driven back to a hospital they left 2 hours ago because they couldn't make themselves stay away. He saw Sera at the station. He walked toward her. He stopped on the other side of the desk and looked at her, at the shaking that was almost gone from her hands, at the scrubs she had been wearing since 7 p.m. the previous night, at the particular quality of exhaustion in her face that wasn't just tiredness. I heard about the lockdown on the staff channel, he said. It's handled. The patient from last night, Delray. 2 people tried. It's handled, she said again. He set his keys on the desk. He didn't pick them back up. I pulled your file this morning, he said. Before I left. HR had a basic record, nursing program, Cantrell. 3 years here. Nothing unusual. I told you it wasn't interesting. I also called a colleague at the VA Medical Center. He knows people who track certain kinds of military service records. He paused. The more classified kind. She looked at him. He found a name, Aldgate said. Not yours, a service name. Someone who worked with special operations evacuation teams in a conflict zone. Someone who was credited with keeping 11 soldiers alive in conditions that, according to my colleague, should have been unsurvivable. He paused again. Someone who requested separation from service under circumstances the record describes as administrative, but that my colleague says nobody actually believes. The lockdown tone shifted to its quieter recovery phase. Down the corridor, the security guard was talking into a radio. The skill set, Aldgate said. Last night, the way you identified a posterior bleed from a lateral approach without direct visualization. The way you talked to me during the repair. He was watching her carefully. That's not nursing school. That's not even residency. She said nothing. That's combat, he said. The morning light was coming through the window at the end of the corridor, the slow gray brightening of an overcast November morning. The hospital was fully awake around them now, the day shift in full motion, orderlies and physicians and the whole complicated machinery of the place doing what it did. What happened to the separation, he asked. It was a quieter question, less certain. She looked at her hands. A decision was made, she said, by people above my pay grade, about whether someone like me was more useful in a classified capacity or more dangerous as a private person with specific knowledge. She paused. I disagreed with the decision. I left. I came here. And nobody found you. Nobody looked very hard, she said. Until last night. Aldgate was quiet for a moment. You saved his life, he said. Delray. You saved it twice in one night, and you're sitting here shaking and you haven't slept, and you just physically detained 2 separate people, and you still haven't left the floor. No. Why? She looked down the corridor at the window of room 7. Because nobody else was going to, she said. It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in 3 years, and she regretted it slightly the moment she said it, the small exposure of something she'd kept deliberately covered. Aldgate looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down in the chair beside her, not adjacent to her, not across from her, just near, the way someone sits when they've decided they're staying somewhere for a while. Then I'll wait with you, he said. She looked at him. Until 9, he said, when they get here. She didn't tell him to leave. That surprised her a little. At 8:53 a.m., her phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Voss. Assets 7 minutes out. Second individual in custody. Do not let anyone else onto that floor. She showed it to Aldgate. He read it. He looked at her. 7 minutes, he said. 7 minutes, she said. She watched the corridor. She watched the elevator. She watched the soft green trace in the window of room 7. And then her phone buzzed again. Different number. Unknown. A single line of text. No name. No context. He told you to. There are 3. Her eyes went to the corridor. The elevator doors opened. The elevator doors opened and nobody stepped out. That was the wrong answer. At 8:53 in the morning in a hospital, elevators don't open onto empty corridors. They deliver people, staff rotating in, residents on rounds, someone from pharmacy with a cart. An empty elevator was not neutral. It was information. Sera was already standing. Aldgate looked at the elevator, then at her. He registered her posture, the shift from seated to ready that had happened in under a second, and something in his face changed. What is it? He said quietly. The elevator, she said. It came up without anyone in it. Could be someone who missed the floor. Could be. She looked at the panel above the elevator doors. It was showing floor 4, which was the ICU floor. No further call registered. Or it could be someone who sent the car up empty to see what was on this floor before they came up themselves. She looked at the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor. Steel door with a narrow vertical window, locked in lockdown. But lockdown protocols operated on key cards, and hospital key cards were not difficult to acquire if you had access to the administrative system, which someone had clearly demonstrated very recently that they did. She looked at the stairwell window. There was no face in it, but something she couldn't quite name made her watch it for 2 more seconds than she should have needed. She picked up her phone and called Breck. Direct call, not the number she'd been using. The secondary number he had given her when they first spoke, the one he said was faster. It picked up on the first ring. "How many of your people are already on this floor?" she said. "None yet. 7 minutes. Someone just sent the elevator up empty. I think your third person is in the building and they've made the first 2. What's your current ETA to physical presence on floor 4? A pause. She heard fast movement in the background, voices. 4 minutes. We have 2 agents in the parking structure. They're moving. I need them now, not in 4 minutes. Wallin? She hung up. She turned to Aldgate. Go stand in the doorway of room 7. Don't go inside, just stand there. If anyone comes toward that room that you don't recognize, you yell my name and you block the door. That's all I'm asking you to do. He looked at her. Preston? She almost never used his name. It landed with weight. Please. He picked up his keys, put them in his pocket, and walked to the door of room 7. He stood in the frame. He looked back at her once, and she nodded, and he stayed. She went to the nurse's station and told Donna to pull every staff member off the ICU corridor and into the side rooms. Not panic, she said, just consolidation. Lockdown protocol, keep everyone back from the main hall. Donna did it without asking why, which was the thing about Donna. She'd spent long enough watching nurses get dismissed and talked over that she had learned to recognize when someone who didn't get listened to had something worth hearing. Within 2 minutes, the main corridor was empty. Just Aldgate in the doorway of room 7 and Sera standing between the nurse's station and the elevator. The stairwell door clicked. Not a full open, just the click of a magnetic lock releasing. Someone with a card on the other side, checking resistance before committing to the pull. She moved to the right, away from the direct line of the stairwell, into the alcove beside the medication room. She pressed her back to the wall and kept her eyes on the door. It opened slowly. The person who came through was not in scrubs. He was in hospital maintenance coveralls, dark gray with a facility patch on the shoulder, and he was carrying a toolbox, which was either a maintenance call or the most obvious cover she'd ever seen. He was large, significantly larger than the previous 2, with the kind of build that suggested the coveralls were the least convincing part of his disguise. He scanned the corridor. He did not see her. He saw Aldgate. His gaze stopped there for a fraction of a second too long, registering the obstacle, calculating. And then he started walking toward room 7 with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided a surgeon standing in a doorway is a problem to be managed. Sera came out of the alcove. "Maintenance call?" she said. He stopped, turned. He was bigger up close, and the toolbox was heavier than a standard facility kit. She could tell by the way he was holding it, the slight forward lean of someone compensating for real weight. Not tools. 4th floor HVAC, he said. The cover story was immediate and smooth, practiced. HVAC junction is on 5, she said. You'd have gotten off 1 floor early. A beat, just enough of a beat to tell her he hadn't expected that. She pressed it. Can I see your work order? We had an incident this morning and administration wants physical work orders verified for anyone on this floor until it's cleared. He set the toolbox down. Which was wrong. You don't set a toolbox down when someone asks to see a work order. You reach into your pocket for your documentation. You set a toolbox down when you need both hands. She was already moving when he came up, and what he brought up was not what she expected. Not a weapon, but a forearm, a hard lateral sweep aimed at knocking her sideways. And she went with it instead of against it, rotating into the motion and using the momentum to drive her elbow back and up into his jaw. His head snapped. He didn't go down. He grabbed for her, got a fistful of her scrub top, and she twisted out of it the way she'd twisted out of worse in spaces with no floor space at all, and when he swung again she was already below the arc. She needed him on the ground and she needed it without becoming the thing that got in her way, so she stopped trying to match force and dropped all the way down, drove her shoulder into his knee from below, and his weight went sideways. He hit the floor hard. She was on his back before he could get his arms under him, both wrists pulled behind him in the configuration that made it physically impossible to generate pushing force, and she stayed there with her knee between his shoulder blades and her full weight committed to it. He was still moving, not giving up, trying to roll, trying to create space. "Stop," she said, and her voice was perfectly flat. "I have your wrist at 12 degrees of extension. If you keep trying to roll, you're going to tear the ligament yourself. Stop moving." He stopped. She was breathing hard. Her knee was screaming from where she'd hit the floor yesterday and hit it again just now, and her shoulder would bruise where she'd driven it into his knee, and her hands were shaking again. Already, the adrenaline not waiting this time. From down the corridor, she heard the elevator open. Real footsteps this time, fast, and two men in dark jackets came around the corner with credentials out and weapons visible at their hips. "Federal agents, don't move." She looked up at them. "He's secured," she said. "Take over carefully. He's going to try to roll when my weight comes off him. Be ready for it." The agent closest to her nodded once and moved into position. She released the wrists and stepped back, and the agent had the restraints on before the man on the floor could do anything useful. She leaned against the wall. Breck appeared behind his agents, and he looked at the man in coveralls being restrained on the ICU floor, and then he looked at Sera, and his expression was the look of someone recalculating something significant. 4 minutes, she said. "I know," he said. He had a heavy toolbox. "You need to look inside it." One of the agents was already opening it. She didn't look. She turned toward room 7, where Aldgate was still standing in the doorway, and he had the expression of a man who had just watched something that had fundamentally revised his understanding of the person he was looking at. "He's okay?" she said, meaning the patient. "He didn't move," Aldgate said. "I watched the monitor. He's stable." "Okay," she said. She sat down on the floor of the corridor with her back against the wall because her legs had decided that they were finished with standing for the moment, and she let them. Nobody said anything about it. By 9:30, the floor had 4 federal agents, a hospital administrator who had stopped trying to look calm, and Lieutenant Colonel Voss, who had driven from the regional field office and arrived 20 minutes after his assets. He stood in the ICU corridor and looked at Sera, who was now sitting in an actual chair at the nurse's station, drinking terrible machine coffee that Priya had fetched for her. "The toolbox," he said. "What was in it?" "Fentanyl compound, modified delivery mechanism, something that could be introduced into an IV line that would metabolize fast enough to look like cardiac failure secondary to surgical trauma." He paused. "It was sophisticated. This wasn't improvised." She thought about that. Whoever planned this had access to pharmaceutical knowledge, medical knowledge. This wasn't contracted out to street-level people. "No," he said. "It wasn't." He sat down across from her. He looked tired, not the tired of a long night, but the tired of a long investigation that kept producing worse answers than the previous ones. "The man you detained this morning, the first one, Marsh, he's talking. He lawyered up within the first hour, but before he did, he said something to the arresting agent that we need you to hear." She looked at him. "He said the operation was commissioned from inside the hospital." The machine coffee was bad enough that she could feel it through the cup. She set it down. "Inside Hargrove," she said. "He didn't name a name. He said someone on staff, and then the lawyer arrived, and that was the end of it. But inside this building, someone knew Delray was here and communicated that to the people trying to kill him." She thought about the timing again. The staffing request filed at 6:03 a.m., 3 hours and 14 minutes after Delray had been admitted. That was fast, but not impossibly fast for someone with inside access, someone who had been notified when a patient matching a certain description was brought in. "Admissions," she said. "Someone in admissions or intake, or someone with access to the real-time patient census." "We're looking at it," Voss said. "I need you to think about last night. Anyone who seemed too interested in Delray, anyone who asked about him who shouldn't have." She thought about the overnight hours, the trauma bay, the OR, the move to the ICU. She thought about faces and conversations and the way the shift had moved. One thing surfaced. "After the surgery," she said, around 4 a.m. A physician came to the ICU desk and asked Donna about the patient from the trauma bay. He said he was checking on a case he'd been consulted on. Who? I didn't recognize him. I assumed he was one of the overnight attendings. He was in a white coat, had a hospital badge. She paused. But I didn't see his face clearly, and I don't know every attending on overnight rotation. Voss made a note. Donna would remember him, Sera said. She remembers everyone. Voss looked across the station to where Donna was sitting with one of the junior agents, giving a statement. He stood. Thank you. He paused. I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly. She looked at him. What you did this morning, 3 times, without backup, without a weapon, in a hospital corridor on a shift you should have finished 2 hours earlier, that's not something most people could have done. That's not something most trained personnel could have done. He paused. I know why you left service. I know the circumstances better than the file reflects. I want you to know that what happened wasn't right, and the people responsible for that decision are no longer in positions where they can make decisions like that. She was quiet for a moment. Is that why you came here personally? She said. Not just to investigate Delray. Partly, he said. We've been trying to find a way to have this conversation for 14 months. You could have called. You changed your number 4 times, he said. A pause that was almost, from someone like Voss, dry. And your address twice. She looked at her hands. The tremor was gone now. Just her hands, a little banged up, still stained faintly with the antimicrobial from the previous night. I don't want to go back, she said. I'm not asking you to, he said. I'm asking you to let us tell the truth about what happened. Officially, on the record. He paused. And I'm asking you to testify. She looked up. To what? To what you know about Marcus Delray, he said. He wasn't the only reason we were looking for you. You and Delray, you have intersecting history. Something you may not know he documented. She stared at him. What do you mean, intersecting history? Voss looked at her steadily. Delray was the contractor who built the oversight case. 11 years of documentation. The criminal operation he was exposing. It's connected to the circumstances that led to your separation from service. He paused. The people who tried to kill him this morning are the same people who forced you out. The corridor was quiet around them, monitors beeping, the soft movement of the hospital going about its morning. That can't be, she started. It is, he said. We'll show you the documentation when it's secure. But Wallin, the reason you were forced out of service, the reason the record says what it says instead of what's true, that was manufactured by the same people Delray has been building a case against for 11 years. He leaned forward slightly. He was coming here, not because of an accident. He was coming to Hargrove because this is where you are. The machine coffee sat on the desk between them, and neither of them touched it. He knew where I was, she said. He found you about 6 months ago. He didn't make contact because he was trying to protect you, protect his witness. He needed to be in front of a federal investigator with his documentation before he reached out. He paused. He almost made it. She thought about the man in room 7, the hand signals in the dark, the field communication that should have been years out of date, signs she hadn't used or seen since a different life, and he'd known she would understand them. I know who you are. He'd known exactly who she was. He'd known it was her hand holding his, in the dark, after surgery. He had found her on purpose and been run off a road trying to reach her and ended up in her operating room by the specific chance of an anonymous 911 call. Except nothing about this felt like chance anymore. The 911 call, she said. Burner phone. We traced the number. To who? Voss was quiet for a beat. To a number registered to Marcus Delray himself. He called it in, before he lost consciousness. She absorbed that. He called his own crash. He got himself to the nearest emergency center and made sure someone would find him. He knew the people behind him would expect him to go to ground, to disappear. Instead, he came to a hospital. A pause. Your hospital. She looked down this corridor at room 7. He needs to wake up, she said. He needs to be able to give testimony. We know. The surgical team, not the surgical team, she said. Me. I need to be in there when he wakes up, Because when he comes around, he's going to use field signals again, and the other nurses won't understand him, and he'll think communication has failed, and he'll try to... She stopped. He might pull the tube, try to talk, damage the repair. Voss looked at her. Can you do that? Medically, are you authorized? I'm his primary nurse on this shift, she said. I'm authorized to be in that room, whether anyone likes it or not. She stood up. Her knee registered a sharp objection, and she ignored it. She walked toward room 7. It does. Marcus Del Rey's eyes opened at 10:14 a.m., and this time they stayed open. The sedation had been partially reversed 20 minutes earlier, a calculated decision by the pulmonology resident after the surgical team reviewed his overnight numbers and concluded the respiratory situation was stable enough to trial extubation. Sera had been in the room when they made the call, and she had said nothing because the numbers supported it, and the decision was clinically sound, and her being there wasn't about overriding anyone's medicine. It was about what happened after the tube came out. He gagged through the extubation, which was expected, and his first attempts at breathing on his own were shallow and slightly panicked, which was also expected. Sera talked him through it with the specific rhythmic cadence that worked for this. Not soothing in the soft way, but paced. Something to lock his breathing onto, something external to follow while his body remembered how to do it on its own. Match this, she said, and breathed deliberately, audibly. Don't rush it. Let the reflex happen. His chest expanded, contracted, again and again. Within 4 minutes, it was regular enough that the resident nodded and stepped back. She stayed. When the room had cleared to just the two of them, the resident stepping out to write the extubation note, the morning nurse reassigned to a different patient temporarily, Marcus Del Rey looked at her with clearer eyes than he'd had at 8:10. He tried to talk. What came out was barely sound, just the rough, scraped quality of a voice that had spent hours around a tube it didn't want. Don't, she said. You can write if you need to say something. I have paper. She held up a small notepad. He shook his head. His mouth moved with more intention this time. Roya, he said, or something that sounded like it, rough and barely there. She didn't know that word. She leaned closer. Say it again. Roya. A pause, each word costing him. The name they used for the operation, in the files. His eyes were urgent. Roya, you have to remember it. She wrote it on the notepad. Roya. The documentation, he said. Not all of it is in the physical copies. He paused to breathe. His oxygen saturation was holding at 93, but the effort of talking was pulling at it. I kept a second version, encoded. Where? His eyes moved to his left hand. She looked at it, saw nothing unusual. An IV line, medical tape, the standard monitor lead on his finger. Then she looked more carefully at the tape. It was double-layered in one place. A small section of the IV tape on his inner forearm, just above the catheter insertion point, had a second layer on top that was slightly different in color, almost imperceptible. She kept her face neutral. She peeled back the edge of the outer tape. Underneath was a strip of material that was not medical tape. It was thinner, with a slightly different texture, and along its inner surface, in ink so small it was nearly invisible, were 22 alphanumeric characters in 2 rows, an access code. She memorized it in the time it took her to press the tape back down. The code opens a remote server, he said. His voice was getting a little stronger, still rough, but more controlled. Everything is there, names, transactions, communication records going back 9 years, enough to... He stopped and breathed. Enough. How do I access it? He told her the domain. She wrote none of it down. She kept it where she had always kept things she needed to survive. Inside her head, in the place that had been trained to hold information under conditions that made notebooks a liability. Who else knows about this, she said. The investigator I contacted, Harlan V. Voss, she said. He's here. Something in Del Rey's face shifted, a fractional release. Tell him, Roya. Tell him the server. He'll know what to do with the rest. I will. He looked at her for a long moment. Up close, she could see that the urgency in his face was layered. There was the immediate urgency of the information, but under it was something older, something that had been carried a long time. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For how it happened, your discharge. I had the documentation for 6 years before I understood who had manufactured it. By the time I connected it to your name, you were already gone." He paused. "I looked for you for 8 months before I found you." "You found me working nights in a hospital," she said. "Yes." She thought about the last 4 years, the small apartment, the night shifts, the specific and deliberate invisibility, the way she had built a life size to fit inside the space where nobody was looking. "What's Roya?" she said. He closed his eyes briefly. "A financial structure, built to route money from defense contracts through a series of shell entities and back into the pockets of 6 people who had oversight authority over the programs." He breathed. 3 of them are still in position. 1 is a ranking member of a federal committee. 1 is a hospital administrator. She went very still. "A hospital administrator," she said. "Hargrove Regional was one of the contract endpoints," he said. "A procurement agreement. Medical supplies, billed at 400% of market rate, routed through a subsidiary that 3 of Roya's architects have ownership stakes in. Hargrove Regional. This hospital. The building she had come to 4 years ago because it was quiet, and the shifts were steady, and nobody ever asked too many questions about a nurse who kept to herself and did her job." "Who?" she said. "At this hospital. Who's connected to it?" He looked at her. "Dr. Miriam Ostergaard," he said. She heard herself breathe. Ostergaard. The chief medical officer who had come to room 7 at 7:35 in the morning, who had reviewed her documentation with the expression of someone evaluating a liability, who had told her to go home at 9 o'clock and said it with the weight of someone who had reasons for wanting her away from this floor. "She doesn't know I know she's connected," Delray said. "The documentation links her through a subsidiary. It's not her name on any of it. It's a legal entity registered in a different state, but the financial trail is clean. Voss needs this," she said. "Yes." He was fading again. Not the sedation, just the sheer cost of what he'd expended. "One more thing." "What?" "The man who called in the crash," he said. "The anonymous 911 call." She waited. "It wasn't me," he said. She stared at him. "I was unconscious before I reached the road," he said. "I don't know who made that call." The corridor outside room 7 was quiet. Through the window, she could see the nurse's station, the federal agents, Voss talking to Donna. Normal. Controlled. Someone had called in the crash from a burner phone registered to Marcus Delray. Someone who was not Marcus Delray. Someone who had known he was on that road, known he'd been run off it, known the number to use to make the call untraceable back to them, and known that this specific hospital was where he needed to be. She thought about Ostergaard, about the Roya connection, about the timeline, about who had access to what and when. Then she thought about something else. The discharge paperwork, her own separation from service. Voss had said the circumstances had been manufactured, that the people responsible were no longer in their positions, not prosecuted, not charged, not held accountable, just moved out of the specific roles where they could make those decisions. She looked at Delray, who was losing his battle with staying conscious, his eyes going heavy and his breathing evening out into something closer to sleep than effort. "Rest," she said. She stepped out of room 7. Voss was at the nurse's station 20 feet away. She walked toward him. She had the code memorized. She had the name Roya. She had Ostergaard's connection and the gap in the 911 call story and the question that was now pressing at everything else. She was 6 feet from Voss when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. Same as before. Same format. The message had 2 lines. Ostergaard left the building at 9:47. She took the patient census log with her. Sera looked up from her phone. Voss was watching her. "We have a problem," she said. Before he could answer, every monitor at the nurse's station spiked simultaneously. The telemetry alarm that covered all ICU rooms, a sudden cascade of alerts that meant multiple patients were in distress. And then the power went out. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. That was long enough. In a hospital ICU, 4 seconds of total power loss meant 4 seconds of ventilators running on internal battery, 4 seconds of monitor blackout, 4 seconds where the only sound was the soft beeping of backup systems coming online one by one in a sequence that sounded almost like panic if you listened to it the wrong way. Emergency lighting kicked in, red-tinged, low, the kind that turned familiar spaces into something that felt wrong. The telemetry monitors came back first, then the overhead panels, and when the full lights returned, the nursing station looked exactly as it had before, except that every person in it was standing instead of sitting. Sera was already at the circuit breaker panel on the wall beside the medication room. She opened it, looked at the switches, found what she was looking for in under 3 seconds. A single breaker in the secondary ICU circuit that had been physically toggled rather than tripped. Not a power failure, not a surge. Someone had manually cut the circuit and let it reset. It had been a diversion. "Voss," she said. He was 2 steps behind her. He looked at the breaker. He understood immediately. When? While we were talking, someone was on this floor or had access to this panel during the last 20 minutes. She looked at the panel door. Standard hospital lock, the kind that opened with a universal facilities key. How many people have facilities access to this floor? "We're pulling that now," one of the agents said from across the station. "Pull it faster." She closed the panel. "The census log? Ostergaard took it when she left the building. That log shows every patient currently admitted, their room assignments, their attending physicians, their current care status." She looked at Voss. "It also shows which rooms have federal security flags on them." He caught it. "She knows how many agents are here and where they're positioned." "She knew before she walked out," Sera said. "The power cut was to confirm it, to see how we responded, where we moved. She's doing reconnaissance." Voss was on his radio in under 2 seconds, clipped and fast, pulling his perimeter agents in tighter and requesting an intercept on Ostergaard's vehicle from the parking structure cameras. Sera was already moving back toward room 7. Aldgate was in the corridor. He'd come out of the room when the power hit, some instinct pulling him toward the open space, and now he fell into step beside her. "What's happening?" he said. "The CMO is connected to the people trying to kill Delray," she said, not stopping. "She left the building 9 minutes ago with patient information. The power cut was deliberate." He was quiet for 3 full strides. Then, "Ostergaard." "Yes." "She's been CMO here for 7 years, he said. It wasn't a defense. It was the sound of a man recalibrating an enormous amount of context very quickly. "I know. She was on the interview panel when I was hired." "I know that too," she said. She pushed into room 7. Marcus Delray was awake. The alarms had pulled him up again. The specific anxiety of someone who has survived multiple attempts on their life and does not take unexpected sounds as neutral. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 91 during the power outage, probably from the spike in heart rate, and was climbing back toward 94. She checked the IV lines first, both intact. She checked the medication port, no sign of tampering, the safety seal still present. She checked the monitor connections, the oxygen feed, the drainage tube from the surgical site. Everything was as it should be. She exhaled. "Someone cut the power," Delray said. His voice was stronger than it had any right to be given what he'd been through. Adrenaline was a better stimulant than most pharmaceuticals. "Briefly," she said. "You're okay." "Ostergaard," he said. She looked at him. "She came to my room at 8:45, he said. "Before you got here. A nurse I didn't recognize brought her in. She said she was doing rounds. She was in this room for about 2 minutes. She looked at my chart. She said something about the surgical repair being remarkable and that she'd review my case personally." He paused. She touched the IV line. Sera looked at the IV line, the bag, the port, the drip rate set on the pump. She looked more carefully at the pump. The rate was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that screamed, not the kind that would have triggered an immediate alarm. But the drip rate on the analgesic line was running at 1.8 milliliters per hour when the surgical order specified 1.2, a small variance. The kind that could be attributed to a pump recalibration, a nurse's adjustment, any of a dozen innocuous explanations. The kind of variance that over 6 to 8 hours would deliver a cumulative dose that would cause respiratory depression in a post-thoracotomy patient with a partially compromised lung. It would look like a complication, secondary pulmonary failure, completely consistent with his surgical history. She shut the pump off. "Priya, bas," she said, louder, toward the door. Priya appeared. "I need a new analgesic line set up on this patient. Fresh bag, fresh tubing, fresh pump. Nothing currently connected to this patient stays connected. Tag everything you pull as evidence and don't touch the ports directly. Use gloves and don't contaminate the surfaces." Priya looked at the IV line, then at Sera's face, and did not ask any questions. She left it something close to a run. Sera turned back to Delray. "She adjusted your medication pump. A slow overdose. It would have looked like your lungs failing from the surgery." He absorbed that with the particular stillness of someone who is no longer surprised by the methods being used against them. "How long before it would have—" 6 hours, she said. "Maybe 8? It would have happened during a shift change, probably, when monitoring is at its lowest point." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, "You caught it." "I caught it. Because you were looking." "Because I was looking," she said. Priya came back with the new setup. Sera ran through the change herself, not because Priya was incapable, but because she needed to know with her own hands that every connection was clean. She flushed the port, primed the new tubing, set the correct rate, verified it twice. Then she went to the door and called Voss. He came to the room. She showed him the original pump settings, the contaminated line, the timeline. His face did something controlled and unhappy. "She was in this room," he said. "At 8:45, according to the patient. That's before I was back on this floor after our conversation." She paused. "Before your agents arrived." "The nurse who brought her in, find out who that was," she said, "because the nurses on this floor do not escort the CMO to patient rooms unprompted. Someone called her up here. Someone on my floor told her Delray was awake." Voss was back on his radio. The search for Ostergaard had already gone from a parking structure intercept to a federal fugitive notice. The moment she'd left the building with the patient census log and a viable tampering charge forming, she had ceased to be an administrator and become a subject. At 11:22 a.m., they found Miriam Ostergaard in the parking structure of a hotel 4 blocks from the hospital. She was in her car. The car was running. She had a phone in her hand, and she had been in the middle of a call when the federal vehicles pulled in from both ends of the structure simultaneously, and whoever she had been calling heard the sound of that, and the line went dead. Sera wasn't there for the arrest. She was on the ICU floor, where she intended to remain until she was physically removed. But Voss sent her a message at 11:31. Subject in custody. Working the phone records. She read it and set her own phone on the desk. Aldgate was at the nurse's station. He had been there for 2 hours now, not doing anything in particular, just present. At some point, someone had brought coffee that was marginally better than the machine version, and he had put a cup near her without comment. She drank it. "The pump," he said. It wasn't a question, just him working through something. She knew the dosing parameters, Sera said. She knew what adjustment would look like incidental. That's not administrative knowledge. That's clinical knowledge. She trained as an anesthesiologist, Aldgate said, before she moved into administration. 20 years ago. Sera looked at him. "You'd know that if you'd been here longer than 3 years, he said. Not unkindly, just a fact. She kept the clinical knowledge current, Sera said. She would have needed to for the procurement fraud, to know which supplies to inflate, which medications to route through the subsidiary, which contracts were too specialized to invite competitive bids. How long has this been going on? 11 years, according to Delray. Aldgate was quiet for a moment. 7 years she's been CMO here. That means she was already embedded when she took this job. This hospital was part of the structure, Sera said. The procurement contracts. She may have been placed here specifically because of the contract relationships. He processed that. The particular silence of someone realizing that a building they've worked in for years was functioning as something other than what it appeared. Does that mean other people here? Probably not, she said. The way these structures work, you don't need to compromise the entire institution. You need one person in the right position with signature authority over the right contracts. Everything else around them operates normally. She operated normally, he said. She ran a good hospital. Criminals usually do, Sera said. The ones who last 11 years, anyway. He sat with that. Breck appeared at the station at 11:45 with a laptop and a printout and the expression of someone who had found something significant. Phone records from Ostergaard's device, he said. She made 3 calls in the 90 minutes after Del Rey was admitted. First one at 2:58 a.m., lasting 4 minutes. Second at 3:40, lasting 11 minutes. Third at 4:03. He set the printout on the desk. The 4:03 call was to the staffing agency that filed the fake credentialing request. The one that sent Marsh, Sera said. Yes. The 11-minute call at 3:40 was to a number registered to a logistics company in Northern Virginia. We're working that one. But the first call bus, 2:58 a.m., 4 minutes, he paused. That went to a direct line at the office of a federal committee member. The nursing station was quiet for a moment. Which committee? Voss said from the doorway. He had come back while they were talking. Breck looked at him. Defense Procurement Oversight. Voss went very still. Which member? Senator Wallace Pruitt. The name landed in the room and nobody moved for a few seconds. Sera didn't know the name in any personal way. She had been deliberately out of the loop of political and administrative Washington for 4 years. But she watched the reaction move through Voss's face and she understood the weight of it from that alone. Pruitt, Voss said, flat, controlled. Ranking member, Breck said. 11 years on the committee, chairs the Medical Procurement Subcommittee. The Roya structure. The financial routing through defense contracts, through procurement agreements, back into the pockets of 6 people with oversight authority. Del Rey had said 3 of them were still in position. 1 was a ranking committee member. He was in the car accident, Sera said. Both men looked at her. Not literally, she said, but he was on the phone with Ostergaard 4 minutes after Del Rey was admitted. If she called him first, before she called the logistics company, before she called the staffing agency, then he's not just a financial beneficiary. He's operational. He gave the order. Breck looked at Voss. A long look. That's a federal senator, Breck said carefully. I know what he is, Voss said. We need the call content, not just the record. I know what we need, Voss said. Work the warrant. He paused. Work it fast. Breck left. Voss looked at Sera. Roya, she said. The access code. The server address. I have both. She had been holding that, waiting for the right moment, waiting to understand enough of the structure to know who to give it to and in what order. I'm not giving them to you until I know the chain of custody is clean. If Pruitt has reach into DCIS, he doesn't have reach into me, Voss said. 4 hours ago, I would have said Ostergaard didn't have reach into this hospital, she said. I'd like to be more careful this time. He looked at her for a long moment. In another version of this conversation, from another kind of person, that might have landed as an insult. Voss took it for what it was. Who do you want in the room? He said. Aldgate, she said. He's not military, not federal, not connected to any of the contract structures. He's a trauma surgeon who filed an incident report this morning and has been sitting here ever since. She paused. I want a witness who has no reason to be anything other than what he is. Voss looked across the station at Aldgate. Aldgate looked back at him with the expression of a man who has spent the morning watching his understanding of a routine night shift rewrite itself into something he would be telling people about for the rest of his career. Fine, Voss said. She gave them the server address from memory, then the access code, all 22 characters in sequence, without hesitation or correction. Voss repeated it back. She confirmed. Breck's team accessed the server from an isolated federal device at 12:08 p.m. What they found took the lead analyst 40 minutes to characterize, and when he came back to the ICU floor to brief Voss, the word he used was comprehensive. 9 years of transaction records, communication logs with timestamps and participant identifiers, shell company registries, contract award records cross-referenced with kickback payments, Personnel files from the defense contracting programs, including files that should not have existed in any civilian repository. Files that documented decisions made about specific military personnel, including decisions that had been characterized in official records as administrative rather than what they actually were. Sera was standing near the window at the end of the corridor when the analyst finished his briefing. The morning had gone gray and wet outside, a November drizzle that made the parking structure and the street beyond it look washed out. Ordinary. The kind of weather that made it hard to believe anything unusual was happening anywhere. She was thinking about what Delray had told her, about the documentation and the name Roya and the financial structure and the 6 people, about Ostergaard in custody, and Pruitt's number in the call log and the 22 characters she had carried in her memory for the last 2 hours. She was thinking about her discharge paperwork, the version that said what it said instead of what was true. Voss came to stand beside her. "The files include your service record," he said. "The actual record, not the version that was filed." She looked at the window. "The documentation shows the decision to alter your file was made by 2 people," he said. "One of them has been dead for 3 years. The other is currently a deputy director at a defense agency and is about to have a very bad afternoon." She said nothing for a moment. "What happened?" she said. "Not a question exactly, more like an opening. You reported a contracting irregularity during your second deployment," he said. "Supplies billed at inflated rates, routed through a subsidiary that the Roya structure controlled. You reported it to your commanding officer. Your CO reported it upward." He paused. "Upward turned out to be the wrong direction." "They manufactured a conduct issue," she said. "They found something small and made it bigger," he said. "The kind of thing that exists in almost anyone's file if you look hard enough. They used it to separate you from service before you could escalate the contracting report to an outside authority. And nobody connected the dots at the time," he said. "Because the dots were in different files, different agencies, different years. That's how Roya worked. Nobody piece ever looked like the whole picture," he paused. "Until Delray spent 11 years putting the whole picture together." She watched the rain on the glass. "How many people?" she said. "In Roya itself. 6 principals, as Delray documented. But the reach is wider. Subcontractors, agency contacts, people who knew and didn't report. We're looking at a minimum of 19 individuals across 3 agencies and 2 congressional offices." He paused. "The hospital contracts represent about 4% of the total financial volume. This goes significantly further than Hargrove." 4%. She thought about how large 4% had to be for the other 96 to be larger still. "Pruitt," she said. "He's the largest single beneficiary on the documented record," Voss said. 11 years of payments. The documentation is—" Breck's word was comprehensive. "What happens now?" "Now we get a federal judge on the phone," he said, "and the U.S. Attorney's Office. And we work through the night and probably the next several nights." He looked at her. "You'll be deposed. Officially. Your testimony about what Delray told you, the access code, the timeline of this morning, goes on the record. Fine. Your service record will also go on the record," he said. "The real one. The correction will be formal and official, and it will sit alongside the altered version in the permanent file so that anyone who reads one reads the other." She looked at him. "Is that supposed to make it better?" "No," he said. "But it's what we can do that's real and permanent and can't be walked back." She turned back to the window. The rain was heavier now. A car moved slowly through the lot below, windshield wipers going, the whole scene reduced to slow gray motion. "There's something else," Voss said. She waited. "The anonymous text messages you received this morning," he said. "The ones that warned you about the second and third operatives." She had been wondering when they were going to get to that. "We traced the number," he said. "It's clean. Another burner, disposed of immediately after the last message." He paused. "But we pulled the cell tower data. The messages were sent from inside this building." She processed that. "Someone in this hospital was feeding me information," she said. "Someone in this building knew about the operation against Delray and chose to help you instead of participate in it." He paused. "We don't know who. And until we do, there's an open question about what they know, what they've kept, and whose side they're actually on." She thought about the messages, the precision of them. "There are 3. Ostergaard left the building at 9:47. She took the patient census log. Not vague warnings, specific operational information delivered at exactly the right moment to be useful. Someone with inside knowledge of the operation. Someone positioned closely enough to know the details in real time. Someone who had decided, at the last moment, to break. It could be someone who got scared, she said. It could be, Voss said. Or someone who was always reluctant and finally had a line they wouldn't cross. Also possible. Or someone who has their own documentation, she said, and is waiting to see whether this goes far enough before they decide whether to surface. Voss was quiet for a moment. We need to find them, he said. She looked at the rain. I know, she said. At 1:15 p.m., Aldgate found her in the break room at the end of the ICU corridor. She was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and a notepad she had been writing nothing on, just turning the pen over and over in her hand, the way she did when she was running through something that wouldn't sit still. He sat down across from her. Delray is asking for you, he said. He should be sleeping. He's not sleeping. He's asking for you. A pause. He says he needs to tell you something he didn't tell Voss. She looked up. Something about the person who made the 911 call, Aldgate said. She put down the pen. She went back to room 7. Marcus Delray was propped slightly higher than before, the head of the bed raised a few degrees. His color was better, his eyes were sharper. He had the look of a man who had decided that recovering quickly was now a matter of some urgency. You said you didn't make the call, she said. I didn't, he said. Then who did? He looked at her steadily. Before I left the meeting in Kettler, I made contact with one other person, someone inside the network, someone who had been feeding information to my investigation for the last 2 years without appearing in any of the documentation. A source, she said. More than a source, he said. Someone who had been inside Roya since the beginning, who had watched it operate and understood what it was, and spent years looking for a way out that didn't end with them in the same position I was in tonight. The text messages, she said. Yes. They're still inside, she said. Still at Hargrove. Yes. He paused. And they're the reason you need to be very careful about who else you trust right now, because there's one piece of the Roya structure that Delray's documentation doesn't fully capture. One person whose role has never been formally documented. Who? He looked at the door, then at her. The person who recruited Ostergaard into the network, he said, 9 years ago, before she came to this hospital, before any of it started here. She waited. It's someone you've met, he said. Someone in this building. She thought about the last 18 hours, every face, every conversation, every person who had moved through the orbit of this room, this floor, this crisis. Who? She said. He said the name. And Sera Wallin went completely still. The name sat in the room like something with mass. Sera didn't move, didn't speak. She ran back through every interaction, every conversation, every moment of the last 18 hours, and she laid the name over it the way you lay a transparency over a map. And the overlay fit. Not perfectly, because nothing about this fit perfectly, but enough. The right pieces aligned in the right places. She thought about the coffee. The chair pulled alongside hers rather than across. The deliberate presence. The questions that had felt like curiosity but could just as easily have been assessment. She thought about the HR file being pulled at 5 in the morning. You're certain, she said. I've been certain for 8 months, Delray said. That's why I didn't make direct contact. That's why I kept the source information separate from the main documentation. Because if I was wrong, I destroyed someone who didn't deserve it. And if I was right... He paused. If I was right, I needed you to be the one who heard it first, because you'd know what to do with it in a way I couldn't predict from a hospital bed. She looked at the door. Preston Aldgate was on the other side of it. She had worked alongside him for 3 years in the specific, limited way she worked alongside everyone at Hargrove, professionally, carefully, with distance maintained as a matter of practice. He had been kind to her in the understated way that competent people are sometimes kind to other competent people they work with, and she had taken it as what it appeared to be. He had pulled her HR file at 5 in the morning. He had come back to the hospital on his day off. He had sat beside her for hours. He had been there for every significant conversation she'd had with Voss and Breck. The recruiting, she said. Ostergaard. 9 years ago, Aldgate would have been a surgical fellow, Delray said, at a different institution. He and Ostergaard overlapped for 14 months at a training program in Baltimore. That's where the connection was established. He paused. He was recruited as a low-level contact, someone who could provide clinical information relevant to the procurement contracts, which medications were being overordered, which supply lines had slack, where the billing inflations would go unnoticed. Did he take money? Twice, Delray said, both payments small enough to stay below reporting thresholds. After the second payment, he stopped, refused further contact. But he never reported it, which means he's been sitting on the knowledge of what Ostergaard was doing for 9 years without saying anything. Until last night, she said. Until last night, he said. I think watching you work, watching what you did in that OR, the surgery, and then this morning, I think something shifted for him. He looked at her. Or maybe he was already shifting and you just accelerated it. She thought about the text messages, the precision. There are 3. The information delivered not from a distance, but from someone who was physically present, who was watching the situation develop in real time and making decisions about what to do with what he knew. Someone who was scared and guilty and probably had been for 9 years. She said nothing for a long moment. What do you need me to do? She said finally. I need you to bring Voss in here, Delray said, without Aldgate, and I need whatever happens next to happen on the record. She nodded. She went to the door. Aldgate was in the corridor, leaning against the wall, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has been thinking hard about something he doesn't fully understand yet. He looked up when she came out. "He okay?" Aldgate said. "He's talking," she said. "He asked me to get Voss. Give us a few minutes." He searched her face. She kept it neutral. Not cold, just still. The practiced stillness she had spent years building and years resenting, and was now, in this specific moment, genuinely grateful for. "Sure," he said. He pushed off the wall. "I'll get more coffee." She watched him walk down the corridor. Then she went to find Voss. Thus, what happened in room 7 over the next 40 minutes was formal and careful, and nothing like what Sera had expected, which was that Voss would hear Delray's information about Aldgate and move immediately. Instead, he listened. He took notes. He asked 4 specific questions about dates and amounts and the name of the Baltimore training program. He verified 2 things on his phone while Delray talked, and then he sat back and was quiet for almost a full minute. "This is a problem," Voss said, and he said it not with alarm but with the specific weariness of someone adding a complication to an already complicated situation. "He sent the texts," Sera said. "Almost certainly," Voss said, "which makes him a witness, a material participant, and a potential federal charge all at the same time." He looked at Delray. "The 2 payments. Do you have documentation?" "Transaction records, routed through the same subsidiary structure as the larger payments. The amounts are small, but the routing is identifiable." Delray paused. He wasn't a true insider. He was someone they touched once and then couldn't fully shake. "That distinction matters legally," Voss said. "Marginally." "It matters to me more than marginally," Sera said. Both men looked at her. "He sent those messages," she said. "He had 9 years of reasons not to, and he did it anyway. This morning, when it mattered, he made a different choice than the one he'd been making." She paused. "That doesn't erase the first choice. But it's not nothing." Voss looked at her steadily. "You're not asking me to ignore. I'm asking you to weigh it accurately," she said. "That's all. I'm not his advocate. I'm telling you what I observed and what I think it means." Voss was quiet for another moment. Then he stood. "I need to speak with him, alone, then with counsel if he wants it." He looked at Sera. "I'll need you to stay away from that conversation." "Understood." She stepped out. She stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the nurses' station where Breck was working with 2 other agents, the hum of a federal investigation now fully occupying what had been, 12 hours ago, a standard overnight shift. She thought about Aldgate, the complex, unglamorous reality of a person who had made a bad choice when they were young and frightened and told themselves it was small enough to contain and had spent 9 years containing it, and had finally found the limit of what containment cost. People were not the worst thing they'd ever done. They were also not absolved of it. The space between those two facts was where most of actual human life happened, and it was not a comfortable space, and there was no clean answer to what lived there. She went to the nurse's station and told Breck about Aldgate. She did it clearly and without editorializing, because the information was Voss's to work with, and Breck needed to know it for the broader picture. Breck listened. His expression was professional and contained. "He's in the break room," she said. "I'll get someone to sit with him until Voss is ready," Breck said. She nodded. She sat down at the desk. She picked up her pen. She looked at the notepad, and for the first time in several hours, she had nothing to run through, no immediate problem to solve, no threat to calculate against. The machinery around her was moving, and it was going to continue moving regardless of what she did with the next 10 minutes. She sat with that for a while. It was not comfortable. She was better at problems than at stillness, better at action than at the particular suspended quality of waiting for other people to do the parts that needed doing. She had spent 4 years being still, and she had never learned to like it. Donna Pfeiffer appeared beside the desk and set a cup of proper coffee. Not machine, not the break room pot, but something from the cart downstairs, next to her hand without saying anything. She started to move away. "Donna," Sera said. She turned back. "Thank you," Sera said, "for this morning. You didn't ask me to explain anything. You just moved." Donna looked at her for a moment. "You've been on this floor for 3 years," she said. "You've never been wrong about anything that mattered. I figured this morning probably wasn't going to be the exception." A pause. "Also, the man looked like trouble the second he stepped off the elevator, and I've been doing this long enough to trust that." She left. Sera drank the coffee. At 3:40 p.m., Preston Aldgate walked out of a conversation with Voss and 2 federal attorneys and a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and he looked like a man who had just set down something very heavy after carrying it for a very long time. He found Sera at the nurse's station. He sat across from her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You knew," he said, "before you sent me to get coffee." "Delray told me," she said. "And you didn't—" He stopped, started again. "You let Voss handle it." "It wasn't mine to handle," she said. He looked at his hands. They were surgeon's hands, careful, precise, trained. "I told them everything, the Baltimore program, Ostergaard, the payments, what I knew about the procurement contracts, what I should have reported 9 years ago." He paused. "I told them about the texts." "Okay." "They're going to charge me," he said. "Failure to report. Possibly conspiracy, though the attorney thinks that won't hold given the facts." He said it flatly, not performing anything. "I'm going to lose my license, at minimum." She looked at him. "You saved a patient's life last night," she said. "And then you sent 3 text messages this morning that gave me the information I needed to keep him alive 3 more times." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you that balances out. It doesn't work like that. But it happened, and it mattered, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't." He was quiet for a long time. "The thing in the OR," he said finally, "when you told me about the vessel, the way you said it." He looked at her. "I knew then that you weren't what your file said you were. And I thought, I need to know who this person is. Because if she's who I think she might be, and she's here, then—" He didn't finish. "Then what?" "Then maybe the right thing was still possible," he said, "even this late." It was an imperfect reason. It was tangled up with guilt and self-interest, and the particular hope of a man who has been watching a slow disaster from the inside and doesn't know how to stop it. But it was also, under all of that, true. She could hear the true part. "It was," she said, "still possible." He nodded once. He stood. "I need to call my attorney." "I know." He left. She watched him go. Senator Wallace Pruitt was arrested at 6:18 p.m. at his office in Washington, D.C. by federal agents from 2 different agencies working under a warrant signed by a federal judge who had cleared her schedule to hear the application at 4 in the afternoon. His chief of staff was taken into custody 40 minutes later at a different location. The arrest was not quiet. Someone in the building filmed it on a phone, and the footage was on national news by 7. Sera saw it on the television mounted in the ICU break room. She watched the footage without sound. Pruitt in his suit, the composed public face giving way briefly to something harder and more afraid as the agents identified themselves. The particular deflation of a man who has believed for 11 years that he was beyond the reach of consequences, encountering the wall of consequences at last. She turned the television off. She did not feel the satisfaction she had imagined she might feel, if she had let herself imagine it. What she felt was more complicated, a kind of relief that was adjacent to grief, the unwinding of something that had been wound very tight for a very long time. Miriam Ostergaard, already in federal custody since 11/22 that morning, was formally charged at 5 p.m. with conspiracy to commit murder, evidence tampering, wire fraud, and 4 counts related to the Roya procurement structure. Her attorney released a statement. Ostergaard herself said nothing to anyone. The logistics company tied to the 11-minute call, the one in Northern Virginia, turned out to be a front organization managed by one of Roya's other principals, a defense agency deputy director named Cormac Leith, who was currently 3 hours into a conversation with federal investigators that was going poorly for him and well for everyone else. He had made the decision that Pruitt, as the largest financial beneficiary and the one who had given the operational order on Delray, was the one he was willing to spend to protect himself. He gave the investigators everything he had. Everything meant 9 years of records, communication logs, and the names of the remaining Roya principals. The fourth person Pruitt had called, an attorney named Diane Forsyth, who had structured the shell company registrations, surrendered to federal authorities voluntarily through her own counsel at 8 p.m. The fifth and sixth names were individuals at 2 separate defense contracting firms who had processed the inflated billing. Both were in federal custody before midnight. All of this Sera learned in pieces, from Breck and Voss, and from her phone, as the evening moved through its hours. What she learned about herself, she learned more slowly. At 8:30 p.m., Voss came to find her in Marcus Delray's room. She had been there for an hour. Not because Delray needed constant nursing. He was stable, his oxygen holding at 95, his pain managed, the surgical repair intact and behaving correctly. She was there because it was where she had been heading, in some sense, for 4 years. And she was not quite ready to leave yet. Voss knocked on the open door. She looked up. "We've completed the preliminary deposition," he said. "Your formal testimony will be scheduled within the next 2 weeks, but the immediate record is solid." He paused. "I have something for you." He held out a document, printed, official letterhead, the specific government formatting she recognized from years of reading forms exactly like it. She took it. It was her service record, the real one, not the altered version, not the document that said what it said instead of what was true, not the file that had followed her out of service and sat somewhere in a system she had no access to, defining her officially as something she wasn't. This one was different. It had a correction notice attached, signed by a deputy secretary whose name she recognized as someone who had been waiting for the documentation to be solid enough to act on. She read it. Her actual service record. The full deployment history. The evaluations that had never made it into the official file. The ones that said things like exceptional tactical judgment under sustained pressure and demonstrated capacity for independent decision-making in zero-resource environments. The credit for the 11 soldiers. The classified commendation that had been quietly removed from her file at the same time her discharge paperwork was being manufactured. All of it, restored, on the record, permanent. She read it twice. She was not going to cry in front of Voss. She had made that decision somewhere around 3 a.m., and she intended to maintain it. "The correction is official as of this afternoon," Voss said. "It will be filed in the permanent federal record and is accessible to any institution or individual who pulls your service history." "Thank you," she said. It came out more quietly than she intended. "There's something else," he said. He sat down in the chair across the bed, not intrusively, just settling in for a conversation. "I'm not here in an official capacity for this part." She looked at him. "The Army Medical Corps is standing up a new program," he said. "Civilian trauma integration. The concept is to embed people with combined military and civilian medical experience in high-volume trauma centers, not as active duty, but as advisors, training developers, People who can translate battlefield medicine into protocols that civilian facilities can implement, particularly for mass casualty events. That's a good program, she said carefully. It's a new program, he said. It doesn't have leadership yet. He looked at her directly. I'm not offering you a position. I don't have the authority to offer you anything officially. What I'm doing, as someone who has spent 14 months looking for you and the last 16 hours watching you work, is telling you that the program exists and that the people building it are looking for someone who has exactly the combination of experience you have. He paused. If you're interested, the right people would take a call from you. She looked down at the service record in her hands. I have a job, she said. You have a night shift, he said. That's not the same thing. It wasn't. She knew that. She had known it for a while, in the way you know things that you're not ready to act on yet. Give me the contact information, she said. He did. Marcus Delray was discharged from Hargrove Regional Medical Center 21 days later. He walked out on his own, which the surgical team had made clear was ambitious given the nature of his repair, and he did it anyway, because he was the kind of person who needed to feel the ground under his own feet in order to believe he was standing on it. He had a cane he didn't entirely need and a federal protective detail he accepted without complaining, and he shook the hands of every nurse on the ICU floor before he left. When he got to Sera, he didn't shake her hand. He held it for a moment, and she let him, and then he let go. Testimony, he said. 3 weeks. I'll be there, she said. He nodded. He left. She watched him go through the glass doors of the main entrance and get into a vehicle she recognized as a federal transport, and then the doors closed and he was gone, and the hospital moved back into its ordinary rhythm around her. The trial of Wallace Pruitt began 4 months later in federal court in Washington, D.C. Sera testified on the third day. She sat in the witness chair in a room that was not as large as she had imagined and gave her account in the flat, precise language she had learned in environments where imprecision got people killed. She described the 911 call, the admission, the surgery, the Roya server and access code, the conversation with Delray, the attempts on his life, and the sequence of events that had brought her from a night shift at a regional hospital to a federal courtroom. She was cross-examined for 2 hours by Pruitt's lead attorney, a thorough and aggressive woman who had clearly done her research and understood that Sera's credibility was the hinge on which a significant portion of the prosecution's case rested. The attorney found nothing to work with. Not because Sera was a perfect witness. She wasn't. She was tired and occasionally clipped, and once answered a question with more honesty than was strictly strategically optimal. But because everything she said was true, and the documentation supported every word of it, and there is a particular quality to testimony that is simply and completely accurate that survives aggressive cross-examination in a way that more polished accounts sometimes don't. Pruitt watched her from the defense table for the duration of her testimony. She did not look at him until she was stepping down from the stand, and then she looked at him once, directly, for about 3 seconds. He held her gaze for one of them and then looked away. She walked out of the courtroom and into the corridor and stood there for a moment, breathing. The federal attorney who had handled her deposition, a composed woman named Layla Morrow, who was not given to unnecessary speech, appeared beside her. That was clean, Morrow said. Good work. Thank you, Sera said. You'll probably be called back for the Ostergaard trial, Morrow said. Different jurisdiction, same core testimony. I know, Sera said. I'll be there. Wallace Pruitt was convicted on all 11 counts 7 weeks later. The verdict was unanimous. The sentencing hearing, scheduled for the following spring, carried a federal guideline range that his attorneys had privately characterized to him in the weeks before the verdict as the effective end of his public life. Miriam Ostergaard pleaded guilty to 5 of 8 charges 2 months before her trial date, in a negotiated agreement that her attorney described as pragmatic. She received 14 years, with the federal judge noting in her sentencing remarks that the decision to use medical knowledge to attempt murder inside a hospital treating vulnerable patients represented a specific and serious breach that the court was disinclined to treat leniently. Cormac Leith received 12 years after his cooperation agreement. Diane Forsyth, whose cooperation had been earlier and more comprehensive, received 7. The 2 contracting firm executives received sentences of 4 and 6 years respectively, both with financial penalties large enough to be genuinely painful. The Roya structure, as a financial operation, was dead. Every shell entity was dissolved by court order. The recovered funds, representing the total traceable financial benefit of 9 years of inflated defense procurement, were returned to the federal treasury and a portion designated specifically for the medical programs that had been underfunded while Roya's architects were extracting money from them. Preston Aldgate lost his surgical license. The medical board proceeding was not pleasant for anyone involved. He did not fight it. He accepted the board's findings and issued a statement that contained no self-justification, which was noted by several people in the room as unusual and, in its way, more honest than most of what the board heard in a given year. There was, separately, a federal charge of failure to report that resulted in a fine and a period of supervised release. He was not imprisoned. Whether that was just was a question that different people who knew the facts answered differently, and Sera was one of the people who held two contradictory answers simultaneously and had decided she was allowed to do that. He sent her one message after it was over. It said, "I hope you find the right next thing." She read it and didn't respond, and then she thought about it for 3 days and called the number Voss had given her. Duh. In the spring, Hargrove Regional Medical Center's Board of Directors held a public meeting at which they formally acknowledged the criminal activity that had been conducted through the hospital's administrative structure under the tenure of the former CMO, and formally acknowledged the role of nursing staff, specific language, specific acknowledgement, in preventing additional harm to a patient under federal protection and exposing the broader network. The board chair read a prepared statement. Sera sat in the third row and listened to it. The statement was careful and institutional, and covered in the careful language of an organization managing its liability while also trying to do something genuine. And those two things did not always sit cleanly together in the same sentences, and the statement was imperfect as a result. She accepted that. Institutions expressing things they have never expressed before are not graceful about it. After the meeting, the board chair, a man named Gerald Poe, whom she had never spoken to in 3 years of working in his hospital, found her in the corridor. "Ms. Wallin," he said. "Nurse Wallin," she said. It still came out with weight, and she still meant it, and she suspected she always would. He accepted the correction. "I understand you've been approached about a federal program." "I have." "I'd like to ask you to consider staying," he said, "not in the same role. We're establishing a clinical safety oversight position, a new function, hospital-wide authority, direct reporting to the board rather than through administration. Someone who can identify the kind of issues that—" He paused. "The kind of issues that should have been identified before they required a federal investigation to surface." She looked at him. He was a bureaucrat with good intentions and probably insufficient understanding of how his own institution worked, which was a common and not entirely damning combination. "I'll think about it," she said. She meant the federal program. She thought about it for 6 more weeks, during which she worked her remaining night shifts at Hargrove and talked to the people building the civilian trauma integration program twice on the phone, and took a weekend to drive 2 hours north and walk in the kind of open space she used to take for granted, and had spent 4 years being too settled in her smallness to seek out. She thought about what Delray had said. "I think watching what you did, something shifted." She thought about what Voss had said about the program, and what Aldgate had said about right things and late timing, and what Donna Pfeiffer had said without saying very much at all. She thought about the 11 soldiers. She had never told that number to anyone at Hargrove. It wasn't in the nursing program file or the HR record, and she had not spoken it aloud in 4 years. She had carried it privately, the way you carry things that are yours entirely, the evidence of what you can do that requires no audience. She did not need an audience now. That wasn't what this was about. But she had spent 4 years making herself small enough to fit inside the space where nobody looked, and the thing about that strategy was that it worked. It had worked. It had kept her safe and invisible and unencumbered. But it also cost something that she had only recently started to accurately name. She was good at this. Not at nursing specifically, though she was that too. At the larger thing. At keeping people alive when the conditions were wrong and the resources were insufficient and the situation was asking for someone who had already been through worse and come out understanding exactly how much a person could actually do when they committed to it fully. She was good at it, and she had been hiding it, and she was 30 years old and tired. She called the program director on a Tuesday afternoon from her apartment, standing at the window with the same kind of gray sky outside that had been there the morning she watched the rain and thought about 4% in the size of the other 96. "I want to talk about the position," she said. "I was hoping you'd call," he said. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected that," he said. She laid them out. They were not unreasonable. They were the conditions of someone who had learned, through very specific experience, what oversight without accountability produced, and who intended to build something that worked differently. The program director listened. He agreed to 3 conditions without discussion and pushed back on 2 others, and they negotiated, and by the end of the conversation they had something that was not perfect and would require work, and would certainly produce problems she couldn't anticipate. She said yes, anyway. Okay. On her last shift at Hargrove Regional, she worked the night rotation as she had worked 3 years of night rotations, without ceremony, without announcement, doing the work until the work was done. Priya was on the same shift. She had grown into her role in the months since November, the way people sometimes grow into themselves after a crisis that asks more of them than they expected to have. She was still 26 and still sometimes uncertain, but she moved through the floor with more authority than she had before. And she had recently submitted a proposal to the nursing director about updating the ICU handoff protocol based on the gaps that had been exposed during the lockdown morning. The proposal had been accepted. At 6:15 a.m., Priya caught Sera at the medication room. "Is it true?" she said. "You're taking the federal position." "Yes," Sera said. "Will you—" She stopped, started again. "Will you come back sometimes to train people, or—" "That's actually part of the job," Sera said. "Civilian facility partnerships. Hargrove is on the list." Priya looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and not quite getting there. "Okay," she said. "Good." Sera looked at her. There was something she had been thinking about saying to Priya for several months, and she had talked herself out of it each time because she had spent long enough being told things by people who thought their experience entitled them to be listened to that she was careful about becoming that herself. But this was different. "You filed that protocol proposal," she said. "Yes." "You didn't ask permission first. You just wrote it and submitted it." Priya looked slightly uncertain about whether this was criticism. "I thought it was correct," Sera said. "The gap you identified was real, and your solution addressed it directly. The nursing director approved it because it was right, not because of who submitted it." She paused. "Keep doing that. Don't ask if it's allowed first. Figure out if it's right first. That's a different question." Priya absorbed that. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Sera said. She finished her shift. She filed her final incident notes with the same precision she brought to all of them. She returned her hospital badge to the facility's desk, and she collected her jacket from the break room, and she walked out through the main entrance into the early morning. The air was cold. March in this part of the country was still winter with optimism, and the parking lot was wet from an overnight rain that had cleared, leaving the sky a clean, unremarkable gray. She stood outside for a moment. She was not the person she had been 3 years ago when she had arrived here, and she was also not the person she had been before that, the one in the service record that had been corrected and filed. She was something that had been built from both of those and from the specific experience of that November night, and everything that had followed, and it was not a tidy thing, and it was not entirely comfortable, and it was, she was increasingly certain, closer to actually herself than either of the previous versions had been. She had kept people alive when it mattered. She had not been thanked for it at the time, because the time had not allowed for thanks, which was fine. That was not why you did it. You did it because the alternative was standing at the foot of a table and accepting an outcome you knew was not the last available one. You did it because the skill was real and the need was real, and the only thing standing between them was someone willing to stop performing smallness long enough to close the distance. She had been that person. She was going to keep being that person. Somewhere with a wider scope and a position that did not require her to frame every observation as a question to avoid making someone feel challenged. She walked to her car. She had a drive ahead of her and an appointment on Thursday, and a stack of program documents she had not finished reading, and her knees still ached when the weather changed. And she had slept badly 3 nights out of the last 5. And she had not figured out yet what she was going to do about the fact that she had spent 4 years not letting herself need things, and was only now beginning to understand the full cost of that. She was not fixed. That was the honest version. She was not healed or resolved or arrived at something clean. She was a person at the beginning of a different chapter, carrying everything from the previous ones, which is the only way anyone ever actually moves forward. The gray sky held. She got in the car and drove. There are people in every room that the room is not designed to see. People who do the work that needs doing without waiting to be asked, who notice what others miss, who carry more than their title suggests and say less than they know. The world tends to organize itself around the loudest person with the most obvious credentials, and it tends, as a result, to be badly surprised when the person it was ignoring turns out to be the one who knew exactly what to do. Sera Wallin had been that surprise. She had not sought it, had in fact spent years preventing it, and the night it happened anyway had cost her more than she expected and returned more than she dared account for. She did not think of herself as a hero. Heroes were a story other people told, and she had learned enough about how stories got told to be skeptical of the versions that made the shape too clean. What she was a person who had refused, at the specific moment it mattered, to accept that standing quietly in the back of the room was the only available option. That refusal had changed nothing about how the world was built, and it had changed everything about what happened in that building, on that shift, to that patient, and to the 11 years of lies that had needed someone stubborn and quiet and very well trained to finally come apart. She drove north. The sky opened into something that might, by afternoon, become blue.